Good afternoon, welcome everyone. I'm Yonca from the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Platform, shortly the CİSÜ Platform. We are very delighted to welcome you today to our first International Network Experiences webinar. The CİSÜ Platform is actually a very young organization that started its activity in this February. But I would like to say a few words about its short history. Can you hear me? Duyabiliyor musunuz? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, it goes back to 1994 UN ICPD conference, International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. The ICPD program of action is a very important reference point in this field, and this program was approved by 179 countries, and Turkey was one of them. During the UN's 20 years review process of ICPD, a policy development and advocacy platform called the Platform on Cairo Plus 20 and Sustainable Development Goals was formed in Turkey. It was comprised of several NGOs, UNFPA, and individual scholars, healthcare workers, and activists. They initiated a conversation between the stakeholders and provided information at local and global levels. But in the meanwhile, the change in political climate, the turn to authoritarianism negatively affected the gender policies as well as health policies. The cooperation between public institutions and civil society decreased, the space of civil society narrowed down. Correspondingly, the significance of sexual and reproductive health and related rights declined in the eyes of law and policymakers. In such a context, the importance of giving weight to advocacy and doing advocacy collectively as a platform is much higher than before. But at the same time, all NGOs are in a survival struggle and conditions are harsh. In this situation, Cairo Plus 20 group evolved into the CİSÜ Platform this year and enlarged with a few new members. The platform aims to create a space for communication and collective advocacy for all NGOs, academics, service providers, and other activists in this field. We aim to make research and monitoring on the current conditions and problems, do data and evidence-based advocacy, build capacity of the platform and its members. Today, we have 26 members with a wide range of experience, including LGBTI+ rights, women's rights, gender equality, humanitarian aid and poverty reduction, medicine, community health, women's health, legal reform, HIV and AIDS prevention, care and support, education and disability. What have we done so far? We have an intensive activity schedule. Although the pandemic slowed us down a bit, we activated our website and social media accounts. We organized a well-attended conference, especially on pandemic, and also the major findings of the sexual and reproductive health in Turkey today. A report was published about the services before and during the pandemic. And in the next term, we will organize meetings with stakeholders, local stakeholders, policymakers, capacity building trainings for NGOs, and publish a monitoring report and a guide for service providers. And another series of meetings we are very excited to start today is International Network Experiences webinars. We will welcome activists from various networks working on SRHR in Europe and around the world. We will hear their experiences on how they built their networks and how they do their advocacy. We will share our experience, our questions in mind, and we will be able to discuss together. We are here for our first webinar with the theme Intersectional Feminist Networks and Sexual and Reproductive Rights. Now, I would like to welcome again our distinguished speakers and turn it over to our moderator, Berfu Şeker, from Women for Women's Human Rights New Ways. Berfu.
Teşekkürler Yonca. Tekrar herkese merhaba ve kusura bakmayın diyerek başlamak istiyorum. Ben de şimdi İngilizceye geçeceğim biraz daha kolay olması için toplantının moderasyonu. My name is Berfu Şeker, as you have heard. I'm working at Women for Women's Human Rights New Ways for like 4.5 years. WWHR is a feminist organization established in 1993. Over a span of 27 years, WWHR has been working at local, national, international level advocacy, capacity building, and feminist knowledge production. And we have been working to advance gender equality and women's rights through networks at different levels. So today, as Yonca has said, we have come together to the first webinar of our series entitled International Network Experiences that we are organizing as CİSÜ Platform, which WWHR is a project partner and an active member. The aim of this webinar series is to share and strengthen cross-solidarity and know-how among different SRHR networks on how they organize, do advocacy, what are the challenges and mitigation strategies. And we are, as Yonca said, in the webinar, Intersectional Feminist Networks and Sexual and Bodily Rights today. We have Rima Athar from Coalition for Sexual and Bodily Rights in Muslim Societies, and Marie-Claire Price from Realizing Sexual and Reproductive Justice Research as speakers today. I would like to welcome them first. Welcome, Rima and Marie-Claire. Today, we aim to know more about the work CSBR and Resurj are doing and hear about the lessons learned, best practices, and challenges that feminist SRHR networks and alliances are going through. We will also focus on collective building strategies, lived realities, feminist care, and accountability approaches, as well as how to measure change. We were planning to have an interactive session. Marie-Claire will be holding an interactive session. So please raise your hand in Marie-Claire's speaking slot to answer her questions. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session, and please write down your questions to the chat box. And we will have a Mentimeter exercise, as Yonca said, to wrap up. So I want to move on to present our speakers. Marie-Claire Price has been a member of Resurj since 2012 and is a member of the Resurj Secretariat, leading on thought leadership, interlinkages, and monitoring and evaluation. She was previously the executive coordinator of the Women Human Rights Defenders International Coalition, the Youth Coalition for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, and UACT European Youth Network for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. Marie-Claire also works on issues related to economic justice and sexual and reproductive justice in the UK, and previously worked with homeless and at-risk young people, leading projects with the UK Family Planning Association, Centrepoint, and with FGM practicing communities at Forward UK. Our next speaker will be Rima. Rima Athar is a feminist organizer with roots in Pakistan. For over 12 years, she has led diverse international programs to strengthen organizing for human rights across the global south, including on issues of internet technology, corporate accountability, challenging fundamentalisms, and ending violence against women and girls. Since 2015, Rima has coordinated the Coalition for Sexual and Bodily Rights in Muslim Societies, working with women's rights, queer and trans activists on the themes of healing, pleasure and well-being, faith and sexuality, and movement building. In 2019, she is the first global feminist lesbian, bisexual, and queer women's conference. Rima is also a Hatha Tantra yogi and happy to teach community. So I want to give the floor to Marie-Claire. Welcome, Marie-Claire, and thank you very much for participating in our event. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Berfu. I'm just going to make sure that the translation is okay and you can hear me okay first. Just a thumbs up is fine. Yeah, awesome. Hi everyone, merhaba. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm really excited to join you and really impressed with how many people have joined this webinar actually for December 2020 and all the Zoom fatigue that we are facing. This is very impressive. So congratulations, and I hope we can have a an interesting conversation, and I hope that I can share some of the experiences and learnings from research and our work that you may find useful, and it would be great to hear also more about all of your work. And as Berfu said, I'll be presenting a bit about research and our history and what we do and our work, and then we can maybe have a bit of a discussion. I have some questions at the end to reflect on together. So please do let me know, translators, and also anyone, if I'm speaking too fast. I have a tendency to do that. But yeah, so please do let me know in the chat. My name is Mary-Claire Price, as Berfu said. I'm based in the UK, in Essex, just outside of London, and I am with the Realising Sexual and Reproductive Justice Resurj Feminist Alliance. And some of you may or may not know Resurj, may follow us on social media. Berfu has been engaged before in some of our cross-regional dialogues, so we know your work somewhat already, and some of your work, and yeah, it'd just be great to share a bit more. I have a presentation. I'm going to turn my camera off and move on to my laptop, so if you just bear with me one moment as I share my screen. And share with you a bit more about research. So, can everyone see the screen? Yes, awesome. Okay, so research. Where do we start? Realising Sexual and Reproductive Justice Feminist Alliance. We're a global South-led transnational feminist alliance working on sexual and reproductive justice. We are made up of, at the moment, 13 feminists who are grounded in their national work and realities in the South. I am obviously based in the North, in the UK, and we have had members before as part of Resurj in the North, so in Ireland, in Poland, etc. Because although we are a South-led feminist network, we also recognise some of the inequalities and issues that need to be addressed in the North that are in terms of sexual and reproductive justice. So we do sometimes have members from the North, but we are a feminist alliance working across different constituencies, identities, and the feminists that are really seeking to realise sexual and reproductive justice for all in their national work. We are very committed to a young feminist leadership, and we have our work, our justice approach really encompasses an understanding that we have and a commitment to addressing the interlinkages between our bodies, our identities, our sexualities, health, human rights, and also in the context that we experience these. So in the context of the ecological, economic, and social crises of our time, as we know all too well this year, how they are affecting how these wider contexts affect our lives. We so I mean, in terms of history of Resurj, we've, as Berfu was saying, we've been around since for 10 years. This year is actually our 10th anniversary, and Resurj really was founded by a group of younger South feminists who were engaging in some of the global UN and regional UN advocacy spaces, such as ICPD follow-ups, the Commission on Population Development, the Commission on the Status of Women, etc. And those group of women identified a gap in the feminist spaces in these kind of advocacy spaces, and within the feminist movement that were really engaging and leading the advocacy there. And that gap was that there was very few younger South feminists in those spaces who were leading the messaging, advocacy messaging, who were engaging in these spaces or were being, given the space to actually engage. So Resurj was founded. Younger South feminists were leading in these spaces, and we're really the ones that were bringing their national realities and perspectives to these global policy spaces. So here we have a picture of us last year at our retreat and us a couple of years ago at another retreat. We have annual retreats together, the collective. So our work is really based on a foundation of our action agenda. Our action agenda is what really is our kind of key priorities, our calls for the realisation of sexual and reproductive justice for women, for adolescents, girls, trans and non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, as well as what we want to see in terms of this leadership of young global South feminists in really shaping global policy, regional policy, national policy, and the policies that really affect our lives. We use this action agenda also to really call attention to the crises that we face, that have been caused by these wider contexts of this neoliberal development model, the ecological climate crisis we face, the development models that we've seen throughout the last 20 years, militarization, occupation, etc. And the increasing attacks that we're seeing on women's human rights defenders, and on bodily autonomy, more broadly, fundamental freedoms, and feminist activists. So as we use an intersectional analysis to examine these issues, and I hope you can still hear me. Can someone just give me a thumbs up? Yes, lovely, because my internet just jumped off. So our intersectional analysis we use to examine, to look at, that's the lens we use to look at sexual and reproductive justice and how it cuts across social, economic and ecological justice. And we interrogate really how sexual and reproductive health laws, policies and programs interact with different structures of power. So we will look at anything from criminalisation. We've done a lot of work around the shortcomings of criminalisation of SRHR violations, which I'll speak to a little more later, through to sexual power related to gender, class, race, ethnicity, and sexual and reproductive health decisions and choices of people. And so this agenda that we have to kind of outlines our key priorities and what we see in terms of the urgent and emerging also crises that we face. So from the heart of Resurj, which is upholding the sexual and reproductive justice of women and all communities, and this younger South leadership and participation and of young South-based feminists, and universal access to sexual and reproductive health and health services. We also in our action agenda have identified a number of priorities related to mitigating and reversing the adverse impacts of extractivist models on ecosystems, for example, or adopting a systemic and sustained human rights and justice approach that addresses sexual and reproductive rights violations, rather than this very, very strong focus on penal and criminal response. So that we have it's a very diverse action agenda that has at the heart of it sexual and reproductive justice. And yeah, you can see, I shall share with Berfu, so if anyone wants to see more about our action agenda, it's also on our website. And yes, we can. So I've mentioned obviously sexual and reproductive justice a couple of times now, and I know that we often use the term sexual and reproductive health and rights with some of the work that happens around ICPD, etc., in the Commission on Population and Development. Now, for us, we use the term sexual and reproductive justice because, and this is the approach that we use, because we believe that the way in which you experience your sexuality, your identity, your body, your freedom is impacted by so many other aspects outside of, and context and experiences outside of just, for example, your ability or accessibility to a sexual and reproductive health service, for example. We have, the picture here is we have this activity that we do where we draw a young person and we identify all the different aspects of their life, economic, political, social, environmental, that impacts their sexual and reproductive health, or their bodily autonomy, or the way they are able to express their sexuality. And we then analyze and look into and seek further to identify the wider ecological, economic, political and social justice issues that affects their sexual and reproductive health and rights. So this is the framework that we use. I'm sure many of you have heard or used yourself this framework, sexual and reproductive justice framework. And again, there's more on our website about that. And if you're interested in discussing that further towards the end in our discussion, then please do. And again, just this is another kind of visual in terms of how we see the way in which the person is political and the way in which our bodies and identities are so impacted by much wider than sexual and reproductive health and rights, but beyond, towards economic justice and environmental justice, for example. One moment. I hope you can see this. So some of the work that we do, we have 4 strategic goals, like areas that we work within, and they cut across each other. One of which is a big part of our work is policy advocacy. And as I said before, our members and their work and experience and learning and priorities that they identify at a national level in their work with their organisations, they bring to, and it really informs Resurj's policy advocacy, our priorities, and what we want to see and highlight, address, and really shine a light on in the global and regional advocacy spaces. So we're engaged in various different fora, including, as I said, the Commission on Population Development over the past 10 years, the Commission on the Status of Women. We've also been engaged with the Sustainable Development Goals process and the annual reviews that happen around them. So the national voluntary reviews, which I'm sure many of you have been engaged with, the Turkey's national voluntary reviews and voluntary national reviews, and the annual global process for that, the high-level political forum, the HLPF. So we are also part of a lot of the women's organising spaces and groups in some of these fora. So, for example, the Women's Major Group, which is an organising space for civil society, feminist activist organisations, women's organisations who are engaging in the Sustainable Development Goals process. And then, for example, the Women's Rights Caucus, which I know and think that some of you are engaged with, that facilitate and support the engagement of feminists at the Commission on the Status of Women, for example. We're also engaged with the Beijing +25 process. A lot of our members have been engaged in the regional Beijing +25 forums that happened last year. Now, obviously, this year things have looked very, very different for us all in terms of the spaces that we can access, like physically access at a global level, also regionally and nationally. So we are still, trying to figure out what that looks like for Resurj moving forward with the context and crises that we face related to the pandemic. And that we are unable to travel or move as freely as before, and that a lot of these spaces are being closed to civil society, with the pandemic. Now, that's on top of, as you all well know, I'm very sure, the already shrinking and closing space for civil society in these advocacy and policy fora. But nonetheless, we are, with our partners, allies, and with our members, trying to think more about how we do this policy advocacy moving forward. Like, what does that look like with the world as it is now. So we also convene, from the beginning, the policy of research, the beginning, policy advocacy was a key area of our work, and also convening cross-regional and regional and national feminist spaces in some of the advocacy spaces that I've mentioned, but then also outside of those advocacy spaces as a way of supporting feminist and supporting feminist movement building, and sharing some of the learning and experience as well of research in terms of our analysis, our advocacy, our feminist movement building and leadership strategies. So we've had very, very many different spaces over the years, including, you'll see Berfu there in this picture here, across regional, and Rima, across regional, a number of cross-regional dialogues, feminist community of care spaces, which we actually, the Commission on the Status of Women, about 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was now, we had a lot of younger South feminists who were approaching research members and saying, look, you know, this space is so hard to engage in. It's hard enough to engage with our representatives here, but even, you know, some of the civil society spaces, etc., we really feel like there isn't a kind of a specific or cohesive space for South feminists organising around the CSW. So we actually just created an informal space for that at one of the commissions on the status of women a couple of years ago, and that has actually grown into a collective space, a space of care and community for South feminists at CSW, and in other spaces. We've actually done 1 or 2 at some regional forums and regional advocacy spaces, and we actually hosted our first virtual FemCom this year as well. So, you know, in terms of, again, what we're facing moving forward and this virtual world that we are really having to adapt to a lot more, even though we're already quite used to it, you know, these kind of online organising spaces and convenings, as well as when we can in-person organising, is really a core part of Resurj's work and strategy, especially around movement building and cross-movement building as well. So really bringing together younger feminists from different constituencies, groups, and movements. So another part of the work we do around young feminist organising and supporting young feminist organising and movement building is the work to support, in particular, regional younger feminist spaces, groups, cohorts. So we have 2 in particular that we've been helping, well, that we've been supporting, sorry, since their formation, and actually Resurj members are engaged in those regional formations, young feminist formations. One is the Vecinas Feministas in Latin America and Caribbean, and the other is the Young African Feminist Dialogues in the Africa region. And these are groups that are completely independent of Resurj. They are not, you know, but we have helped to form, build, strengthen, and strategize and work alongside these groups, like as our allies and our accomplices in the work. And so it's really amazing to see that these groups over the last 2-3 years have really grown, and it's an amazing part of the advocacy work as well, because a lot of these groups are taking a very strong lead in their region on sexual and reproductive justice and interlinkages with economic and environmental justice, and are really you know, carving out a very strong space for themselves in feminist movements. So yeah, this is another part of the work that we're doing. We also, you'll see here, is a small leaflet, but that we had with in fact It was in collaboration, partnership with Rima and CSBR to healing circles that we have been conducting online this year, a virtual space for healing and connection with other South feminists. I don't know if Rima's planning to. I'm sure she will talk a little bit more about this space. So another area of our work, again, in terms of informing our advocacy and setting our priorities and linking to our action agenda, is our thought leadership work. I'm actually the coordinator of the thought leadership, the thought area of work for thought leadership, and this is an area that really, you know, there's so many different areas to our work around sexual and reproductive justice and interlinkages that we wanted to explore further and really deepen our thinking on. And, you know, big questions that we had, actually, some that really challenged the status quo of not just the status quo broadly, but also within feminist movements, like some questions that we were asking ourselves around, you know, how do we really respond to sexual and reproductive rights violations? Is criminalisation really working? What alternatives are there that can work alongside criminalisation? Or questions that we have around you know, the way in which organising happens in advocacy spaces, or the questions that we have around the links between militarisation and sexual and reproductive justice, for example. So mainly, though, over the last couple of years, the work has been focused on this beyond criminalisation. So we actually had we actually published a research report, a desk research report last year, Beyond Criminalisation, a feminist questioning of criminal justice interventions to address sexual and reproductive rights violations. And we hosted 3 webinars around this as well this year. If anyone's interested, they're on our YouTube page. And the report and the webinar was really looking at what are the impact, what's the shortcomings, what are the shortcomings of a solely penal and criminal response to violations. And when I say violations, we specifically were looking at FGM, female genital mutilation, domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and child marriage. So we had some really interesting conversations and, well, analysis in the report, and case studies, and then also conversations in the webinar that considered not only the shortcomings of criminalisation, but also starting to look to, okay, what does with our justice framework, what does justice really look like when we're talking about addressing, either preventing or addressing violations? So please do take a look at those webinars if you're interested, because we will be continuing, and anyone that wants to join that conversation moving forward, will be continuing that into next year, and hopefully have a few more interesting dialogues and conversations around this. And in particular, we'll be looking towards what the alternatives, and we're really interested to hear about alternatives to criminalisation from, you know, really local experiences and the impacts, challenges and barriers related to those. So please do join those conversations moving forward if you are interested. I've mentioned interlinkages as well. Can I just have a time check from someone? Sorry, just so that I know.
15 minutes it has been, I think.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much. So I've also mentioned interlinkages a lot, and it really is a very core part of Resurj's work. As I said, when Resurj was first founded, we were very focused on the sexual and reproductive health rights spaces and policies. So ICPD and CPD, for example, and national policy related to sexual and reproductive health and rights. However, as the years went on and we started to engage with members who were part of other constituencies, as we started to engage in other policy spaces and with other feminist movements or other movements who are working on environmental justice, economic justice, we saw that in terms of our analysis, that interlinkages was, we were going to have to deepen and broaden our interlinkages analysis, because as I said at the beginning, with this sexual and reproductive justice framework that we use, we cannot separate austerity and access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. We cannot separate conflict and drought and food security with bodies and sexualities and identities. So our interlinkages analysis, we produce a number of different resources, analysis, and then also that informs our advocacy messaging. So we try to ensure that this interlinkages analysis and approach is also something that we're calling for in these policy spaces. So, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, as you will all know or may know, with the Sustainable Development Goals, you have these kind of siloed goals with a couple of cross-cutting themes or priorities. And for us, that these goals are really inseparable in terms of the way they affect each other. So if if we're talking about FGM under one goal, we also need to be considering the priority of education in another goal, or the priority of access to sanitation in another goal, or even access to or even issues of conflict, etc. We have a couple of projects that have been ongoing for the last couple of years. We have a project called Our Lived Realities, and that is a project by some members in Brazil, Nigeria, Lebanon, and Rwanda, I think so far, that are really looking at the realities and stories of young girls and adolescents in their communities, and trying to show through their stories how these different parts of their lives affect their or are affected by actually their sexual and reproductive health and rights. So, for example, in Nigeria, our colleague in Nigeria was making the link between conflicts between farmers and pastoralists around access to water and access for their livestock, and migration throughout the country of pastoralists, and conflict that was happening around land and security of land, with they made the link with that and the sexual and reproductive health and rights of adolescent girls in those communities. So how is that conflict and a conflict over resources and access to food and issues around land and agriculture linked to how is that affecting the ways in which adolescent girls were accessing education, accessing sexual and reproductive health rights services and information, etc. In Lebanon, we had a similar project, but it was focused on migrant domestic workers and their lived experiences of issues around immigration, issues around violence, around migrant status, and how that impacted their ability to realise their sexual and reproductive rights, and also access information and violence services, etc. The same in Brazil, we had a project that was looking at the Zika virus and the links between racism, access to water and sanitation, and adolescent girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights. So our interlinkages, we actually have a monthly or bi-monthly newsletter that we send out, reflections from our countries that are doing exactly this, trying to identify some of the interlinkages in our countries and members' rights analysis. We have space for guest analysis as well, and we often do have allies and accomplices providing some reflections. So if anyone's ever interested around sexual and reproductive justice and the interlinkages with economic and environmental justice. So we've had everything from links between the rise of the right and conservatism and access to comprehensive sexuality education, through to militarization and access to violence services. So it's a very rich read. So if you are interested in either sharing an analysis through that platform or reading, please do look on our website. We also have had a campaign in the last year on Instagram, 365 ways to be feminist, and we are, if you want to take a look at them on our Instagram, we often do partner with allies and accomplices around this. So it's really trying to make the links between sexual and reproductive justice and other areas of economic and environmental justice, as well as sharing some of our strategies and thinking around, a feminist approach to different aspects of our life. So a feminist approach to money, a feminist approach to work, etc., etc. So please do check that out as well. And then the final kind of area that we work on is, our foundation, our base, our collective, and alliance. So this is very much the way in which we work together across our members, across our different organisations, how we work cross-regionally, and how we work with our accomplices and our allies. And so we try to meet, again, in terms of where we're at the moment in the world, it looks a bit different this year, but we do try to meet at least once a year as a collective, and then we are continuously meeting and engaging with one another throughout the year at different policy and advocacy spaces, and regionally and globally, as well as alongside our friends and our allies. So getting down to the kind of discussion questions. I'm sorry, I haven't had a look at the chat, so I'm not sure if there's actually any questions so far, but I don't think there is. Let me have a look. Oh, thanks for sharing the link. Okay. Well, if there are questions, they're in Turkish, so I'm very sorry. but we can start to have a bit of a discussion if you're up for that. I mean, we in terms of our strategies and our approaches, I think this is probably more the kind of conversation you wanted to have, but I hope that sharing a bit more about what we do was useful in maybe picking up some of the areas of work that Resurj works on. But one of a big kind of foundation of Resurj is our approach to feminist care and accountability. And we have many feminist accountability practices that have been developed and redeveloped and revisited, like a true praxis approach to feminist accountability over the years. I've already explained the justice approach, so really how we aim to transform power inequities and create this long-term change that we want to do through our justice approach. So how we increase capacities and support leadership and ask the questions that need to be asked, even if they're not questions that, there's sometimes pushback, or there's, not everyone's comfortable with the questions we're asking, like and challenging the status quo. And then we also have guidelines. So I'm sure in some of your organizations you have some sort of guidelines around your internal practice and accountability mechanism that really is a good framework for how you work with each other within the collective, how we collect stories. For example, we have specific feminist guidelines on how we collect and share stories and narratives for our Lived Realities project, for example, with a feminist approach to research and story sharing, and general working agreements and things like that within the guidelines. Practice what we preach. I mean, we can't talk about justice approach if in our own internal workings we don't have that approach. So from everything from having a parental leave policy that we have, through to healthcare support for secretariat members, we have a small child or travel child support policy. So some of our members have children, and we support them to be able to travel to these advocacy spaces with their children and support for that, and some of these kind of more daily kind of policies and things that support our members. So really trying to practice what we preach. Our decision making is horizontal and built on consensus. So because we kind of try to embody this feminist collective spirit, and we, you know, sometimes we fail, sometimes we have to go back to the drawing board and start again. So it's a constant process of accountability and care, really, for the collective and each other. And so we ascribe to this building consensus-based decision, which is really, I don't know how many of you here use consensus building. It is not easy. It's a hard process, and you really have to commit to it. But we've really kind of been defining our own ways of how to practice consensus building in our decision making. And mutual aid. So mutual aid has taken various different forms over the year, but we've actually just developed a mutual aid strategy for our members and a mutual aid fund, because of the shift this year that was caused by the pandemic in terms of our priorities, where we want to be, etc., and where our members' priorities and their work. We've actually set up a fund for our members to be able to do some work that responds in line with their existing goals and strategies, but responds to the crisis that they face from the pandemic. Collective care, is that me? I'm not sure if that's me. Collective care, again, another feminist practice where we, for example, our annual retreats as a space where we kind of renew and revive and reflect. And then we also, again, you know, nowhere is perfect. We have conflict internally, we have conflict externally. It happens, and we have really kind of robust and well thought out, after many years, mechanisms for conflict resolution. And again, this praxis approach of trying them out, reviewing them, revising them, are they working, and retrying again. And as I said, we have horizontal leadership, share power, and we try to create some of these alternative spaces with, for example, the feminist communities of care. So alternative spaces where feminists can really strategize and engage and feel safe and supported, and that this feminist care for these spaces is really the center. I've already mentioned practicing in the communities of care. So my question to you all was, and I don't know if we've got any questions yet, but I'll read in a second. Like, what do you understand by the, that should say above practices and mechanisms for feminist accountability, and how do you use these in your work and activism? And are there ones that you know are more interested in that you don't use, or what are the barriers and challenges to some of these? Because there are barriers and there's a lot of challenges to some of these approaches of feminist care and accountability. So it'd be great to hear from you all, like any of these that you use or you're interested in using, or sharing some of your experiences.
You can participate by raising your hand if anyone wants to answer the question.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me? I don't know how to raise a hand. I couldn't find that button, but okay. I'd like to ask a question if that's possible.
Yes.
My name is Esham Wortmann, and I'm an international human rights lawyer based in Germany. I was wondering whether you had, like, specifically or just if you encountered any work while, how can I formulate that? Whether you had any experience working with the people with mental disabilities, like women with mental disabilities. So if yes, how was that? Or have you heard of a project like this, or have you worked on such a thing? So I would just like to hear a little bit about it. Whether it was by choice or by chance.
Thanks for the question. I mean, we work across many different constituencies of women and LBT folk and gender non-conforming. So yes, we have definitely worked with. We haven't had a specific project around either disability justice or mental health, but it is very much integrated into some of our analysis, especially the disability justice work and analysis with some of our members who would be engaging more in their national or regional work with this. I mean, I personally as well have worked with some disability justice activists here in the UK, and it's really interesting some of the conversations around sexual and reproductive health and rights as well. You know, there's a lot of how would you say, I mean, we call them fault lines is probably the best way to describe amongst some of these movements, that actually once you sit down and work and converse and dialogue with, you know, these different movements, there's a lot of points of similarities, and really in terms of drive and vision that you have and share in terms of justice and rights. So we've worked somewhat in different capacities, but we haven't had a specific project. I don't know, Rima may have more examples of that. But yes, thank you for the question.
Thank you for the answer.
So we have started to take the questions. So let's take the questions regarding Marie-Claire's presentation. If you have any, you can write in the chat box or you can raise your hand. Either one is okay. And you can raise your hand at the right of the screen. When you click on the participants button, you will see invite, mute me, and raise hand options. Raise hand option. If you can click on that, you will be raising your hand.
I did see there was one question about the consensus building, and yeah, I mean it's not, we don't work with that all people have to be in agreement, so agreement by all people, which is it's a case of sometimes we have it where everyone's in agreement, which is brilliant, and sometimes it can be very easy and swift and lovely and smooth. But then in terms of the consensus building, sometimes it's a case of you know, there is consensus to move forward even though there's not necessarily agreement from everyone, but there is agreement from everyone to move forward. So that's how we really try to practice our consensus building, and it's not about convincing each other or you know, trying to make sure that everyone kind of signs on the dotted line in agreement, but that we feel we've had enough thinking, discussion about whatever the decision is, and that we can move forward from there. I hope that answers that question. It's not easy. Anyone that uses consensus building, like, we really want to make sure that the decisions, the way we build the decisions are clear, that we really don't want to, that we want to give space to hear all options, opinions, views, rationales, and that we can move forward even though sometimes we get stuck in the mud with who agrees and who doesn't, and that can be around anything.
If no one has another question, I would like to ask you one thing, Marie-Claire. You talked about Resurj's origins. It came out of the spaces which are not including young feminists like CSW or other multilateral spaces that are very hard to reach, participate in, especially for younger feminists. So why do you think this is so important for young feminists to be in these spaces?
Yeah, I mean, it looks so, I don't know, I mean, anyone else who's been involved, I've been involved in these kind of spaces for 12 or so years, I mean, Rima can probably reflect as well, but it does look different now. Like, it feels different. The civil society space generally is being a lot more closed, a lot more you know, hoops to jump through to even engage. And even when you do engage, the mechanisms are set up to really make sure you don't engage, to, you know, in a way that is meaningful. But in terms of so it has changed, but it certainly does need to strengthen, and that is because you know, in terms of the decisions that are being made around policy, I mean, who else knows more than the people that are affected by that exact policy, and that are most affected by that policy? And rather than have someone that's representing them, either a government representative or you know, some NGO that's completely detached from realities at the community level or on the ground, like actually having younger South feminists in these spaces, like leading the conversations, is so key. And it's also not, you know, sometimes it gets a little bit, how do you say, sometimes it can feel a little bit that, you know, space is being given to South feminists. So, okay, it's tokenistic. Oh, we have people from, you know, we have one representative from MENA, we have one representative from Africa, one representative from Latin America, but everyone else is an INGO. But we have our young South feminists here, but they're not allowed to say a word. You know, you still have that, and but I think that isn't young feminist leadership. It's not about giving space, like it's also not about taking space. It's about the space being owned and led by feminists from the South. And I'm sure Rima can share a little bit more about that, her experiences from their side as well.
We have a question in the chat box. Can you open up a bit about your community building methods and how you organize the orientation of new members as well as new volunteers? The community itself evolves somehow with each new participation. How do you formulate this and help the newcomers to get involved quickly and easily?
Sure. Can you see me now? Put my camera back.
Yeah.
So yeah, so with the membership, we don't do open calls for members. What we actually do is we work with people, allies, accomplices, and you know, we identify some of the gaps within Resurj's membership in terms of knowledge, in terms of constituency. We don't tick boxes. We don't say, oh, you know, we need to have 2 from Africa, 2 from Latin America. It's very much about building an alliance of members who are you know, who are bringing their priorities around some of our action agenda to Resurj, and that can share analysis, that can work together transnationally and connect their national and community level work with the regional and global advocacy. So we work with allies, friends, etc., and then we may identify someone and say, oh, you know, potentially this person could be a Resurj member. Then we work with them a bit more thoroughly for a time, and then invite them for membership. And the membership the members are individuals, even though they have organizations. It's not the organizations that are members, it's the individuals that are members of Resurj. So and we have a really diverse group, not that we are looking for or trying to tick boxes around diversity, but we do have a diverse group in terms of region, constituency, etc. So gender, sexuality. So we so I think that answers that question, maybe. I hope.
Thank you very much, Marie-Claire. Ezel has a question also.
Yes, I couldn't find the raise hand option, sorry. So regarding the relation national and global level advocacy, when it comes to SRHR, objections are raised in the name of kind of cultural relativity against the right-based approach, and this might be really trouble. So I'd like to hear your experience and thoughts to tackle these objections, because it does, I think, matter in shaping our discourse and policy at the global level, I think, or vice versa. So
yeah.
Your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that this is something Rima can definitely speak to in terms of the, rise of that we're seeing across our region and every region in terms of the rise of this of fundamentalisms, of the rise of the right, and this pushback on sexual and reproductive health and rights more broadly. And then we're seeing these new strategies and tactics being introduced around, for example, gender ideology. Even the battles around using the word gender in some of these policy and advocacy spaces are really becoming very problematic. And then obviously around sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we also consider that, for example, some of the criminalization that happens around some of the protectionist laws that we are seeing around adolescent sexuality and rights are also extremely problematic, because we work on our work is based on the belief that that adolescents also have bodily autonomy, and their sexual and reproductive health and rights need to be realised. And we are seeing more and more move towards protectionist laws that aim to protect the body's rights of young people, of adolescents, but in fact actually do the opposite. So I think we're seeing these really problematic rises in this kind of like anti-SRHR movements. You see what's happening in Poland, you see what's happening in Brazil, like everywhere. It's there's really a massive pushback, but there's also some very what's the word, like kind of more sly moves that are happening in different countries and different spaces. It's not necessarily, it's kind of these very small steps that they are pushing towards anti-SRHR rhetoric in the media, in the policy, the little words they're throwing in here, there and everywhere. So it's really important that, we are really trying to, we really try to keep a very close eye on these things that are happening, anti-sexual and reproductive health and rights moves, but as I'm sure you will do, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think Rima can speak to that more as well. I'm just checking the time as well, because I think maybe my time may be up or soon up.
Yeah, I think there's no more questions right now.
Bir sorumuz var. Ben
Buyurun
soru soruyorum.
Gülten Hanım. Buyurun. Sorabilirsiniz, buyurun.
Merhabalar. Bu güzel sunum için teşekkür ediyorum. Ben Türkiye'den katılıyorum. Çok çok teşekkür ederim. Şimdi biraz evvel bir arkadaşımız cinsel haklar ve ayrımcılıkla uğraşan bir alanda bulunan ve de ruh sağlığı bozuk gruplarla da çalışmalarınız var mı diye sordu. Ve orada net bir cevap alamadık. Şimdi ben bir ruh sağlığı çalışanı olarak şunu çok kendi ülkemde izliyorum, görüyorum. Demek ki bu biraz da küresel bir davranış. Çünkü cinsel sorunların ruh sağlığının temelinde olduğunu biliyoruz. Hani engellilerle ilgili çalışmalar yapılırken tabii ki ruh sağlığı bir engellilik olarak algılanmayacaktır, ama onlarla neden farklı gruplar ve oluşumları sizler de yapamamışsınız? Bunu anlamak istiyorum. Çünkü ayrımcılığa en çok tabi tutulan ruh sağlığı da sorunları olanlardır. Ailesi utanır, toplum dışlar. Bunlarla da ilgili örnek davranışlar ve örnek çalışmalar, örnek gruplar oluşturmak mümkün değil mi? Bunu soruyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
I don't know if there's, maybe there's anyone else that wants to share their experience or groups that they know, organizations? I mean, I only know a couple here in the UK that work on this and try to include, if you can be more specific in terms of this, the groups that you're referring to, and then that might help, that may be helpful.
Yani ruh sağlığı bozuk olan insanlardan kastediyorum, ruh sağlığı.
Oh, okay. Yes. I mean, I don't know, there may be, I can't answer that specifically because it's not my area, but I mean, it's definitely in terms of mental health and sexual and reproductive justice, of course, this is something we really need to, you know, engage the voices of those who are working and who are also, who have, you know, mental health issues in terms of the impacts on their sexual and reproductive health and rights and how they experience their sexualities, their identities. This is really important, but I don't know, there may be someone else on who is working in this area. If there is, please do add.
Thank you very much, Marie Claire.
Teşekkür ederim. Çok teşekkür.
I think no one else is going to answer the question also. We can now move on to with Rima's presentation, I think. We are a little bit late. Sorry, Rima. So I'm giving the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Berfu, and everyone. Thank you, Marie Claire, for that beautiful presentation. So inspiring, the work of Resurj. I'm so happy and excited to be here and part of this conversation. It always really, I think it's one of my favorite conversations to discuss how we organize and some of the inner workings. So I think that what I wanted to share today is a little bit about the history of the Coalition for Sexual and Bodily Rights in Muslim societies, but it's a network that's existed for 20 years. So I obviously can't condense 20 years of incredible work into this presentation, but I thought I would look at a little bit of what we do in our history, but then also some of the very practical ways we've grappled with some of the tensions around collective ownership, around accountability, around transparency through some of our programs. So I'll share my screen quickly. And similarly, if I am speaking too quickly, please let me know. I have a tendency to do that, so hopefully you can just see the screen. So the Coalition for Sexual and Bodily Rights, I just thought I would give you very briefly. The mission since its founding in 2001 has been to support the integration of a holistic approach to sexual and bodily rights as human rights across Muslim societies. So we act as a resource hub to strengthen capacity and increase solidarity across regions, themes, and constituencies so that our movements succeed in accessing and transforming power structures and decision-making processes to ensure sexual and reproductive autonomy, bodily integrity, and gender justice for all. I think what's really interesting also about, hearing Resurj's articulation of a sexual and reproductive justice framework. I think in 2001, when CSBR was formed, that language, that framework wasn't quite there, but I think it's very much embedded into the history of this network, which has been about linking always sexuality and the body to these greater systems of economic, political, social, cultural, sort of systems of oppression, right? And so I think the questions around sort of, our members, let me just share this map here so you can see this. So this is sort of the countries where our members are located. And so it's across the Middle East and North Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, really Muslim majority context led by and for civil society in the global South in these countries. And I think at the moment we have about 30 member organizations. So our structure is really organization based. But we also have individual networkers, which I'll talk about later. And so while CSBR itself then was sort of founded as a shared platform for action, but our member organizations are working on a whole host of issues at the national level. So including sort of the empowerment of women and girls at all levels, sexual and reproductive health rights and access for all, rights and non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and sex characteristics, ending all forms of gender-based violence, including particularly early and forced marriages as well, comprehensive rights-based sexuality education, also freedom of expression and freedom of assembly as sort of key rights that intersect with sexual and bodily autonomy, freedom of religion and belief, including the rights of religious and ethnic minorities, and women's political leadership and women's economic rights, and then demilitarization, peace, and security. So again, you know, a vast platform of action areas, which really encompasses this idea of sort of sexual and bodily autonomy, integrity, and a justice framework. So the ways that we do this currently is sort of four kind of overlapping areas or methods of action. So the first is sort of using our convening power as a regional solidarity network that has a sort of bird's eye view and connections with groups all over, and also is linked to international advocacy spaces and in conversation with other feminist networks and LGBTIQ networks around the globe. So hosting strategic convenings for activists to come together and build shared platforms for actions. I think this has been foundational from the very beginning of CSBR's experience. And so the photos here are just an example. So this one here is actually in 2013, and it's the Arab Youth Coalition, sort of pre-caucus before the ICPD regional review that year. This is a convening that we held in 2018, which was the end of a regional program that we had done to actually address sort of these issues around sort of mental health, physical well-being, risk and security for human rights defenders, particularly those working on LGBTIQ rights in Asia. And it was the first program of its kind, and it was a collaboration between ourselves and 5 other regional networks in Asia to try and sort of crack open this conversation. And I think it just, you know, picking up from what people have shared in this conversation, I think addressing mental health at this sort of more mainstream and at a larger level within our movements is still quite new. And so our entry point for that was really looking at what are the mental health impacts on activists because of the work that we're doing? And how does this then sort of undercut and undermine our movements? And so how do we pay attention to holistic security and well-being for activists? And our idea was the best way to do this, sort of learnings from that, and then this convening that we're talking about here, was everyone sort of coming back together and sort of building a framework for action. So what were different entry points that we could all collectively address and or individually take forward. This other one here is Tejra Sadat, which I will talk about again in a minute, but this was the first convening by and for trans activists in Muslim societies that has ever been held. And it brought together trans activists from South and Southeast Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. And our role as a network was really playing the support and facilitative role, because we're not a trans-led network. And so I do want to talk about that later. But we still had maybe that unique space of understanding Muslim majority context, understanding the politics, and the ways in which sexuality and the body are politicized. And so why we were, you know, then well placed to sort of support trans activists to build a shared agenda for action. Another area that we do is strengthening activist capacities and resources. And this focuses more on sort of the local organizing. So this is, again, bringing activists together across borders to share strategies and experiences, to understand the political context, what's similar, what's different, and particularly how the opposition or how the right wing or how fundamentalists or whoever it is that are anti-rights actors is the language we use these days. People trying to rescind sexual and reproductive rights. What are their strategies? And then how are we able to navigate and negotiate those, but also how do we create our own alternatives? How do we continue to advance our goals? And so it often looks like gatherings at the regional level, but with a really deep focus on national level strategies as well. And so how we can strengthen the national work through that sharing of experiences. This is a photo here of our Sexuality Institute. This was one of, I think, the flagship programs of CSBR, and I think it's still so relevant and important and speaks to some of the questions around how you counter the arguments around cultural relativism. So the Sexuality Institute was really formed as a sort of intensive space to unpack and analyze these sort of discourses that were coming at the time from all sorts of governments, our own governments, you know, but also sort of imperialist governments, and the ways in which these arguments were then being integrated into all sorts of policies, from economic policies to like justifying war, to justifying, you know, sanctions and other things. And so how did we want to counteract that? And how do you understand sexuality in the body as connected to these bigger political systems? And by bringing activists in our context together, you know, from sort of Muslim majority backgrounds, also being able to particularly look at sort of Islamic fundamentalisms and challenge those narratives. And I think one of the shared strengths of working across Muslim majority societies is sort of exploding this myth, right? That there is a Muslim world, or that there's anything similar. And really you begin to see all the different ways in which each government sort of picks and chooses what it wants to put forward, or, you know, different right-wing movements pick and choose what they want to put forward to articulate this idea of a monolithic, static culture and religion. So the Sexuality Institute is a great space to sort of explode that. This is a forum, so it's a lesbian, bisexual, queer, and trans women's pre-conference at a regional LGBT forum. And this was in 2017. And one of the things we've really been focusing on is strengthening support for LGBTQ women and trans folks within Muslim majority contexts as well, but also just within feminist and LGBTIQ movements. And it was the first of its kind, and we're sort of continuing to support LGBTQ peoples to organize on their own since then. This one is actually in Uganda, so not a member organization, but someone who had connected through our Sexuality Institutes and then was interacting and sort of engaging with our different programming and international campaigns, sort of working on localizing some of the learnings from the Sexuality Institute into the action and organizing in Uganda. So just, again, another picture of the local links. The third strategy is sort of solidarity campaigns and actions to create these interlinkages on sexual and bodily rights with the larger systems. And also, again, to show the breadth and diversity of what it is activists have to struggle with and are grappling with, and how these different rights are connected. So the Coalition for Sexual and Bodily Rights also runs an international campaign called One Day, One Struggle every year on 9th November. And our members, our allies, our partners all put on events that articulate whatever is current at that moment in time. And so again, we sort of are having these sort of actions in conversation and also in solidarity, saying, you know, we're in different contexts, but what's happening in Bangladesh matters to what's happening in Tunisia, matters to what's happening in Turkey and, you know, Pakistan and beyond. So this is an example of, in Malaysia, a Muslim women's organization having a public sort of demonstration and campaign on sexual harassment and street harassment. This is actually here in Turkey. This is Kaos GL, you know, taking to the boats to sort of find alternative space when sort of street parades were shut down and other things. This is an online discussion that was held around revenge porn. So the idea of, you know, how violence against women is translated online, how digital technology is also impacting expressions of gender-based violence. And then this one here was a tweet chat we did with sex worker-led organizations, and again, acting in solidarity to amplify sort of support for sex workers' rights and access to justice through a dialogue that we could have. So those are just some examples. And then the last piece is knowledge building from a feminist lens. So here, feminism, again, coming at it from this sort of idea of like a political framework, a philosophical framework and a sort of intellectual framework to interrogate the bigger systems. And so doing research that links different contexts. So the middle one here, sexual politics in Muslim societies, this was led by Women for Women's Human Rights, actually, and sort of worked with partners in about 6 countries to do case studies around the sort of rising fundamentalisms and the links between governments and right-wing parties, sort of capturing the state structures and sort of infiltrating in different areas, that sort of rhetoric and discourse that, again, you know, cultural rights or religious rights don't allow for sexual and bodily autonomy, women's places in the home, LGBT people don't exist, etc. And it's a really powerful, I think, for us to capture this sort of these records, right? Because this publication actually looks maybe about 10 years back, but it allows us to understand now in the current moment, you know, when we go back and look at it, like what was happening then, how has the landscape shifted, what is still happening, and then, you know, allow us to adjust our strategies. And so I think that that research and knowledge production integrated into our sort of continuing and evolving programming and strategies is really key to the work that CSBR does. This publication on the right, Creating Care and Sustaining Wellbeing, actually documents the outcomes of the regional program I mentioned, looking at mental health and well-being, looking at sort of bodily and spiritual autonomy, and some of the tensions and challenges actually within movements. And I would, maybe we can share the link with this, but this might be really interesting because I think what we learned from that program is that we are often reproducing the structures we're fighting against outside within our movements. And so this has a lot of lessons for us around accountability practices, around what care actually means, around how you navigate tensions, you know, a lot of what Marie-Claire was sharing at the end, you know, how research puts this into practice internally. This program of ours was sort of a starting point, and we've built a lot since then. And then this last one, the signs in ourselves. I'm so excited this is out here. It's basically a research project that was by and for queer Muslim activists. And that's been a really big part of our programming on faith and sexuality in the last few years. When I think CSBR was founded, and back then in 2001, both the feminist movement and the LGBTIQ movements had a really hard time engaging with faith-based discourse, right? And activism from within that framework due to these tensions around fundamentalisms, the way it was cropping up, and kind of a lack of awareness and maybe a discomfort on how to engage. And I think in the last 6 years, it's been incredibly apparent to us as a network that there was no way we couldn't, as a solidarity network, start supporting queer Muslims particularly, who really through their lived experiences actually represent, you know, sort of a beautiful answer to a lot of the erasure and the demonization and the attempts to curtail sexual and bodily autonomy for all folks by religious fundamentalists. And so this is, you know, really framed more as a community resource. It's really meant to be by and for queer Muslims, but it's an important tool for allies as well. And I think it's an important lessons and learnings for the rest of us, because it impacts then how we shape our arguments, how we respond in international spaces. And in some ways, putting forth lived realities allows us to stop being on the back hold or like the back foot, right? So we're not reacting, we're actually saying, you don't need to go to the experts, you don't need to go to religious authorities. People are living their lives, they have reconciled it. These are the ways in which that is going forward. And so I think that that's quite powerful as well. So this is just a summary of our 4 programs, which I've talked about a bit. So, and then the critical resistance and new imaginings, the last piece, that's really, again, where we connect with different feminist networks globally and try and counter any pushback we're experiencing in international space. So countering the shrinking space for civil society, doing that through our campaigns, through research, through advocacy as well. Therefore, how am I doing for time?
You have 10 minutes, I think.
Okay, great, perfect. Yeah. So that's a little bit about, you know, what we do currently. I just wanted to share that, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure within and what's happened and what shifted. So this question, how have we existed for 20 years? Which I say with a bit of a smile and a laugh, because it's quite a feat, I think. And we have existed as an unregistered, informal coalition that has a rotating office structure that has sort of reinvented itself continuously, right? And I think that these are sort of the four key things to think about. And really what's allowed us, I think, to continue, is this responsiveness to challenges and needs, and also the flexibility in the structure. So when it was founded, it was led by Women for Women's Human Rights New Ways in Turkey. And as I shared, it was much more, I think, a bit of the history that Resurj shared. So those first 10 years of CSBR were really about international policy advocacy and establishing sort of a public discourse on sexual and bodily rights locally and regionally, particularly in the MENA, and then ensuring that activists, feminist activists, critical thinkers, independent activists were visible and present in international advocacy spaces like the ICPD, like CSW, etc., to counteract a lot of the politicization that was happening then. And 2001, of course, was right before, the network was founded right before 9/11 happened. And it was founded sort of with foresight of the deep ways in which sexuality and the body would become linked with geopolitics. I mean, it had already been, but just an advancement of that, right? And so that was really the focus in the first sort of 10 years, and then undertaking research and trainings again to expose the politics underlying rising and shifting fundamentalisms. What it went to then, though, so after 10 years, though, you have a coalition, you've got different member organizations, you're talking about sort of some of the challenges and also the changing landscape. And so the General Assembly, so the membership sort of had conversations about the future of the network and decided that it would really be important to put into practice this idea of shared leadership and changing coordinating offices. So allowing different members the chance to experience the coordination, to sort of lead some of the work, to also bring their agenda issues into sort of the shared platform for action in a more concrete way. And so the second coordinating office was Nasawiya in Lebanon, which was a queer feminist collective. And they sort of took on, what had been happening previously, but then just by their nature of being a younger, feminist collective, strengthened this focus on younger activism in international spaces, particularly. And then at that time, when CSBR was founded, it was really about the MENA region, and then expanded to include South and Southeast Asia. So the second term sort of again focused more on these sort of cross-regional linking and learning events, and the sexuality institutes and trainings to build those bridges between activists. One of the challenges that already happened, though, with the shift in leadership and the rotating coordinating office, was sort of a challenge of internal capacity. So while in theory and practice you want to do the shared leadership, there's often real constraints around your ability to access funds, your capacity to hold certain grants, also the difference in relationships between member organizations. And I think this is an interesting tension for networks. We are for member organizations, but it's often individuals within those that really build the relationships that keep the network going, right? And then I think there's also always this sort of a challenge around autonomy of new leadership, right? So how much space and flexibility do sort of the folks coming in have to take an agenda forward or to change direction versus what was done before? So Nasawiya led the coalition for 3 years, and then we shifted to Gaya Nusantara, which is the oldest LGBT organization in Indonesia, still in existence. And that's when I joined in 2015 as the coordinator. So I've been on for about 6 years now, almost 5.5. And the shift here was really interesting. So right when I came in, the General Assembly had sort of made a decision that international policy advocacy, which was such a strength of this network for the last 15 years or 13 years, was not really what made sense anymore. And so we sort of, as the shared platform for action, left advocating as CSBR in those spaces and sort of focused more on this idea of movement building support. I think part of this reflects some of what, Marie-Claire, you were talking about, the changing landscape, but maybe a positive change, right? Which is that there had been enough organizing and activism, enough strength, enough new coalitions coming together, enough maybe global South activists, etc., accessing those spaces to make it feel that, you know, CSBR on its own didn't necessarily need to be there, and that activists were still, from these contexts, were still managing to find ways to engage and connect. That was the positive side. The challenging side was actually that, you know, those spaces were becoming oddly inaccessible, increasingly inaccessible, and increasingly disconnected from the national level and regional level. And so the idea was really like CSBR, with its bird's eye view, with its links to the global, but could really maybe channel funding support and channel capacity strengthening support to regional movements. And so that's really where we shifted our focus. We also expanded to include members in Central Asia, which was super exciting for us because, again, geopolitics, Central Asia is usually included with Europe, but there's really interesting histories and shared, you know, strength for activists to connect with others from Muslim majority contexts who also come at this again from like a strength-based affirmative approach, right? We then obviously, you know, the focus shifted very much towards support for LGBTIQ rights, especially within faith-based perspectives, as I said, but that was due to the necessity. But what I thought was really interesting when I came on, one of the challenges is that, you know, this was in 2015, and I know that feminists now often talk about, you know, women and trans and non-binary and all the rest of it, and it's become part of the language, which shows you the shift that's happened in 5 years. But when we started, you know, being super vocal about this, a lot of our feminist funders were like, oh, sorry, you're too focused on LGBT issues. It's not a women's rights issue anymore. Like, we're not going to be able to support your work. And conversely, we had tons of LGBT funders being like, oh, this is so exciting, doing such important work. What's funny to me about this is that our work hadn't shifted. CSBR had always been articulating for this holistic sort of approach, but this, I think, is a challenge around how we are perceived and how donor agendas also influence our capacity to do advocacy and to do organizing and sort of the bubbles that you're placed in. I think we also had some pushback, frankly, though, from different like feminist groups saying, yeah, well, you don't want to be marginalized or you don't want to be seen as doing only LGBT work, do you? But the question back to them for me was like, well, who's seeing us that way? You know, this is kind of also, I think, not really recognizing the important need to support women within LGBTI movements and address some of like the reproduction of patriarchy and cisnormativity and other things that happens within movements as well. So that was a fun challenge that we worked through. We also brought in a whole new generation of member organizations. So, you know, 13 years, there became a sort of a gap, right? In terms of who was engaging, what they were engaging on, what the needs were. And so this coordinating office has sort of built a new generation of membership, which is really exciting, but it changes the landscape continuously. And speaking to, you know, sort of the question from somebody around how members come in and out. So I thought I would show you this because to me, we are the most fluid, constantly changing, constantly evolving network I've ever been a part of. And I think that that has its challenges, but I think that it's also quite positive. So we still are, similarly to Resurj, built on existing relationships. Groups can apply to become members, but they have to have demonstrated a commitment to the coalition, shared organizing, been engaged in some way, and there has to be a relationship of trust that the analysis, the actions, that the values are all aligned with what the coalition stands for. We often have sort of steering committee members, like our steering committees for different projects that are made up from both our member organizations and also the individual networkers who engage with us. They may also come from like collaborators or partner organizations, you know, so it's very fluid and dynamic that way. And all of these people often make up the project and program teams as well. And so the implementation, because it is really a sort of, I don't think CSBR has done anything that wasn't collaborative in the last 6 years. It wasn't working with other networks and organizations to build on our shared strengths. Lessons learned along the way. So these are kind of the questions we continue to come back to every time we're developing a program, right? So what is it that we can do together that we can't do alone? And what's the niche within the existing landscape? What are the gaps and needs we're really responding to? Because I think one of the challenges as a shared platform for action is that you can lose sight of your mission or your vision, and you can sort of continue to just search for funds to continue doing what you've always been doing. But it takes a lot of time and energy to be intentional about what you're really trying to fill, what rights you're trying to advance, and how, and where the gaps are. And then asking ourselves, why are we best placed to do it? Like, who's involved? What are our strengths? And who else do we need to bring on board, and how? So I just want to end with this example. So strengthening community-led organizing. So coming back to the Tejasodat convening, so some of the tough questions we had to ask were, how do we support, community-led mobilizing by and for trans activists when we are not a trans-led network? And the amount of outreach we had to do. And so it was really that process of sharing very honestly, transparently, openly, like, these are the thoughts. We were partnering with a trans-led organization that had said, basically, there's never been a space only by and for trans folks at all. In their experiences, especially in Muslim majority societies. And so they trusted CSBR as a network to hold that space, and they had been part of our network before. But we had to go around sort of like asking for very honest feedback and sharing where we were at with all sorts of trans and LGBTIQ-led groups to get their affirmation, really, that we should be the ones doing this the way we wanted to do it, that, and changing our program with their feedback and input. I think this, with solidarity being the reason for CSBR existing, it's often different from NGOs that maybe say we have this agenda. I think when solidarity is your reason for being, it asks you to do things differently. It asks you to take more time and to be more transparent and more accountable. One of the greatest things about this was working with donors to change their expectations. So we brought on board a steering committee of trans activists who liked the project, wanted to be involved, wanted to lead it. CSBR played only a facilitative role, but we also used our leverage and power and access with donors to get funding for the project. And then we also played the role of having to negotiate with donors to change their expectations and demands to meet what activists needed to happen. And those weren't always easy conversations to have, but it was sort of, a really powerful move to do it. And in the end, it worked out really well. So things around like branding, getting rid of that and why that's important in some of our movements, right? When you want it to be community led, not sort of putting out stories of, shame and trauma and all of the negative stories we're often told to report in order to make it sellable, so really working with some of those issues, and then changing plans where like the donors had wanted to be involved in the convening, and we said, sorry, there's actually no cis people involved, myself included, right? I was there where the meeting was happening, but I wasn't involved in the space itself. And that was a commitment to it being only by and for trans folks. And then I think this idea of, as a network, as a platform, if you're working in solidarity, how do you make yourselves unnecessary, right? And less visible? And is that maybe the end goal that we're actually going for in some ways? If community-led organizing is the goal, then anyone who's playing an intermediary role or support role eventually, hopefully, would not be needed, right? So just keeping that kind of in mind. And then this also idea of participants versus collaborators. So just challenging some of the ways we conceive of who comes to spaces, who holds knowledge, who's leading, and recognizing that everyone has the expertise already, and it's our shared responsibility to sort of uplift that. And I think I will leave it there. These are some of the challenges. I'll just leave this on the screen. So, despite however you prepare for shifts and changes, however you figure out systems, I think for us, one of the biggest things has been political, social, economic, climate crises. Means that there is always pressure on our members. There's always pressure on the Secretariat. It's very hard to maintain a structure and to maintain, where you're going due to that. I think, again, I mentioned sort of the donor agenda, the way it impacts networks. And the last question I just wanted to leave everyone with was, what would it mean for platforms and networks to allow themselves to exist only for a finite goal? And sometimes I think we overlook that because we get caught up in this idea of existing because there's work that needs to be done, because we have the expertise. But more and more, it's sort of this question about, what is our clear exit strategy? What are our definitions for ending? And then, you know, how will our process look and feel to be successful? And how will we know when we've reached our goals? And what does that tell us about how we want to organize, given the challenges that are coming around, you know, just in sustainability for a lot of our movements. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions that may exist or just have a discussion as we want to.
Thank you very much, Rima. I think I can go first with a question. You know, faith and sexuality, or gender diversity, or sexual diversity, are conceptualized like two things that are exclusive of each other. So how does CSBR change the discourse around this perception that faith versus sexual and gender diversity? What is the specific position of CSBR in this discourse?
So that's a great question. I think, you know, and I'll share this, I think quite honestly. So, you know, back when the Sexuality Institute was formed, I think the way CSBR engages with this, first and foremost, has been through looking at sort of thought, leadership and intellectual engagement with academic texts, with sacred texts, and with sort of, you know, political positions by conservatives and or fundamentalists, through a feminist lens, right? And so a lot of the work that we're doing now that supports maybe LGBTIQ folks of faith was started with the work that women did, sort of challenging the ideas around gender roles and women's roles, also from within faith-based traditions, right? So there's been a ton of really powerful sort of feminist intellectual engagement and challenging around interpretations of the Quranic verses. And, you know, we kind of support people, women and LGBTIQ folks, to realize that there isn't necessarily a contradiction and a tension if you know how to go to the texts themselves, if you have a deeper understanding of the arguments and the positions and the ideas that sort of are used against us. So I guess, you know, traditionally this is called looking at counter narratives. But I think it's deeper than that. I think what we've done since looking at sort of the women's sort of feminist reinterpretations and engagement with the text, and now with, you know, LGBTIQ folks did that as well. They looked at, you know, the story of Lot. They looked at all of the things that are traditionally used to say, you know, that LGBTIQ people are sort of sinful or invalid or demonized, and actually show that, you know, in sacred text, LGBTIQ people aren't mentioned in the way that we consider it now. So historicizing discourse and also looking at the change between, you know, the way you can't transpose what's historical onto the present moment. I think a lot of it is unlearning and unpacking that. And then as I shared, you know, the lived realities of being queer and being Muslim, or being queer and being Christian. So we do a lot of interfaith work, and we do a lot of just sort of self-acceptance and self-affirmation work. And our position is really that everybody, if you're looking at it from within a faith-based perspective, is a reflection of sort of like divine expression and divine creation, right? And it's been really powerful to support queer communities in allyship and with allies to do it at those multiple levels. So engaging with the sacred texts, understanding the discourse, and then also looking at it from a human rights-based approach, right? So, you know, I think the story of Pakistan is really powerful here, where the legal gender recognition bill is probably the most progressive in the world, and it built off, you know, the successes of what was happening in the region, but it also had to go through the Council of Islamic Ideology, right? And there was no resistance. It was actually, I mean, obviously there was resistance along the way, but the point is the bill was passed. And it's kind of also because there is an understanding of gender diversity within South Asia historically, right? And so a lot of this is also a decolonial approach and a decolonial understanding of gender and sexual diversity, which has existed historically forever. And so those are kind of the elements that CSBR brings in and ties together, but I would hesitate to say there's only one position and that there's only one way to look at it.
Thank you, Rima.
I have a question, if no one else in line. Okay, I wonder how you could, and you still do, mediate and try to solve this conflict arose by the fund givers you mentioned with a mainstream women's rights perspective when you give more weight to LGBTI plus rights in your work. Can you open up that process a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can tell you that it's just still an ongoing challenge. But I think it's important for us to talk about it and to have these conversations more openly, right? Because it's not like I think that there's an intention. It's not like an intentional attempt to marginalize or sideline. I think there is a genuine lack of understanding, right, around the integration of these issues, around the fact that these are connected and interconnected. And then I think it's also maybe just a challenge of how different funders have been set up and the fact that some of them simply do have priorities, So one of the other challenges we experienced was when CSBR was coordinated in Turkey and in Lebanon, the donors who supported it were those who only wanted to focus on, MENA region. And when it moved to Asia, despite the fact that we were still doing cross-regional work, some of our funders were like, well, we don't fund Asia, so we're not going to continue funding you. And, at a certain level, you can't do anything about that. There's that power dynamic. And so we just had to kind of constantly search and look for, okay, well, which donors would be interested in us? But I will say that in my experience, one of the things that's been really made it easier is to be able to have these frank conversations with donors and also to realize, that we really want to work with donors who understand what we're doing. And so if that maybe means we get less money in a certain year, or if that means that, it has to change the structure, I think that we're willing to work with that to figure out how we can do the work we want to do in the way we want to do it. And I do think, though, also that we're just very cognizant that funding comes and goes. And I think the idea of a solidarity network and the work that we do is all ideally also like, how do you continue to do this work if funding disappears? And those are some of the tough questions. I don't have answers for that, but we are working with that and we are continuing to think about that. And we are like, in what ways can we support each other and still do joint actions if donors don't understand this? And the last thing I'll say is that when I brought this up, I think I found, honestly found LGBTIQ donors to understand the need to integrate a feminist lens and to support LBQ women and trans folk and intersex folk and sort of deal with those internal tensions around patriarchy much more willing than I have found sort of women's rights donors to be willing to sort of shift towards LGBTIQ support. So I don't know what that's about, but I do think that it's still a hesitancy and a discomfort and maybe just a lack of understanding still around sexual and bodily autonomy for all.
Thanks a lot.
Are there any questions? So we are out of questions, I think. So thank you very much, Rima, for this presentation, and thank you very much, Marie-Claire. This was a very fruitful conversation, I think, especially when you pointed out that sexuality and bodily issues should be, considered in a bigger picture, in a holistic manner, in systems of oppression, and we should be always aware of the intersections of class, race, gender, and all other things, social, economic, and environmental causes. So it was very fascinating to listen to you both and the work that you have done. It's very inspiring. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure, and I hope our collaborators have enjoyed our session also. So thank you very much. If you want to say last words, please feel free to do so.
No, just to say thank you for having me, and thanks Rima as well. That was really interesting, and I'm so impressed that like so many people are still on the call. Like this never happens in a Zoom call in 2020. This is amazing. So thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to meet you.
In Turkey, this is our way to do it.
Amazing. We need to learn, honestly. Brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say thank you as well. A pleasure as always to be here, and yeah, to hear and learn from the folks on the call. And I hope we can continue to connect and have these conversations.
Yeah, that would be great. So thank you all. And I see hands, and see you later.